All right, I think we are good to go now. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn presentation, Orlando Sports Stadium, Rebels, Wrestlers, and Rock and Rollers. My name is Jeremy Heilman. I am the Assistant Curator of Collections here at the Orange County Regional History Center. Want to thank everyone for joining us today in person and also for those who are watching on our live webinar. If anybody has any questions, we'll save those for the end. For those of you who are here, we're going to do it where there's little like notepads on the table. So if you want to write down your questions, they'll be collected at the end. And if you're joining us online, feel free to leave questions or comments in the chat, and those will be relayed to me by Cheyenne. So today we're covering a topic that I think is a really interesting part of local history. The Orlando Sports Stadium was an indoor arena that opened in 1967 on the Econ Trail just off of Highway 50 on the east side of town. And even though it's no longer standing, a lot of people here locally have great memories of their experiences there. So today I'm going to talk about how it came to be, why it was important to our community, and some of the really significant events that happened there over the years. Before we get started, I just also wanted to say that it's always a challenge for event-based sort of research to kind of track down dates and all that kind of thing. So really wouldn't have been possible without the Orlando Sentinel archives. So a lot of the clippings that you see here that kind of depict that stuff is thanks to them. So the story of the sports stadium really can't be separated from its builder and owner, Pete Ashlock. So Pete was born Grover Cleveland Ashlock Jr. in 1922. He was from Decatur, Texas, and lived a really extraordinary life. He was a real cowboy, and when I say that, I don't mean that just in like personality or spirit. He was an actual rodeo cowboy. He belonged to pretty much every civic organization you could think of, the American Legion, the Elks Lodge, the Shriners. He was a Marine and a World War II veteran, an entrepreneur and businessman, a pilot, a husband, a father, so a real Renaissance man. The rodeo and his time there would take him all over the country, and at various points he worked as both a cowboy and as an employee of a contractor that supplied the livestock for the various competitions. Got a lot of notes today. There's a lot to cover. So, his work would also introduce him to a secretary that worked for the Rodeo Association named Mary West, who was from Orlando, Florida, and would soon become his wife. In 1951, the Ashlocks settled for good in Central Florida, and Pete went to work in construction and land clearing. He learned the ropes, and then he bought his first piece of large equipment and would start his own company. That was called Crane and Equipment Rental Incorporated. And he was involved in a lot of different businesses over the years, but the Crane Company was among the most successful, and his family would be involved in that industry for decades to come after that. So his company's equipment was actually part of the construction of various parts of Kennedy Space Center and the Walt Disney World Resort, so kind of a cool tie-in there as well. In 1966, he began construction on the Orlando Sports Stadium on a property that he owned in East Orlando. And there are a lot of stories about the creation and kind of the reasoning behind him doing so. The original idea was to create an indoor facility to host rodeos. As we know, sometimes the weather here in Florida can cause problems for outdoor events. So he had previously staged a rodeo at the Tangerine Bowl and had two of the sessions rained out. And he also looked into hosting a rodeo at the Municipal Auditorium, which was rejected, and he decided to kind of blaze his own trail and actually build his own arena. If you look at most sporting venues today, pretty much all of them are built in cooperation with their municipality and often receive funding kind of on the basis that there's a pretty large economic benefit to hosting large events. But things were a lot different in the 1960s, and Orlando wasn't quite the major metropolitan area that it would become later. So it kind of seemed to most folks that what already existed here, be it the Tinker Field, the Tangerine Bowl, the Municipal Auditorium, that kind of thing, were probably good enough as far as event venues go. So He pressed ahead and did it on his own, essentially, spending $740,000 of his own money to put this up. And he really was the kind of guy that just got things done, did things his way, and was really frustrated with the bureaucracy that would kind of keep him from doing such a project. There was a Sports Illustrated article about Pete in 1979 that really gives a lot of insight into his, kind of motivations and mentality. So I'm going to quote that a couple of times throughout this presentation because I think it really does give some insight into who he was as a person. But on the creation of the stadium, there's an excerpt, and it reads, "How did he plan to make money by having one rodeo a year in the place? That wasn't the point," he says. "I like rodeo." His architects presented him with a plan that called for 468 tons of steel, which I couldn't afford, Ashlock says. So he redesigned the structure, used 168 tons of steel, and now people come from all around to see how it was done. So as you can probably tell, he really bucked convention in a big way. So the rebel part of Rebels, Wrestlers, and Rock and Roller is really a nod to him because he really rebelled against kind of the norm and the conventional wisdom that would have really rendered this whole idea pretty much impossible. So this is a photo of the Ashlock family in the 1960s. So from left to right there, you see Pete, Mary, Tommy, Barbara, and Alan. Unfortunately, Pete, Mary, and Tommy are no longer with us, but I was very lucky to get to meet and conduct an oral history with Alan and Barbara, who live here locally and have probably the coolest stories you can possibly imagine about kind of growing up in this environment. It wasn't just Pete that kind of made this happen. There were a lot of folks, including the whole family, but others who kind of helped him take on the project. Because the Ashlock home was on the same property as the stadium, the kids would clean up the trash from the construction as they walked home from school and would pitch in on the weekends doing whatever kind of needed to be done. Mary would bring a big pot of chili to the stadium and set it on the bleachers so that everybody working could have something to eat. So Barbara, who, like I said, we got to talk to, was older, so she was kind of the age where she got to work on the box office and had kind of a first-hand experience with the sort of ins and outs of doing these kind of events. And Alan, the youngest on the end there, was, as I said, the youngest, so he helped more with like the setup and takedown of different things over the years. But one of the things that really stands out about what Alan said is that he really doesn't think that anybody can say that they had a better childhood than him, because he grew up right across the way from a motocross track, had these big rock and roll bands playing across the street, had the circus there every year. So definitely a unique and probably a pretty cool experience to grow up like that. And I do want to say also that this is kind of our, as collectively the History Center's sort of first dive into this topic. But I think that pretty much every facet of what happened there could probably warrant a separate discussion. So we are working with the Ashlock family to get some more items for our collection, some photos of the stadium and different things. So they've already been generous enough to donate a couple of items, which we actually have on display in the back of the room here. So if you want to check that out before you go, for those of you here in person, for those joining virtually, sorry about that. But thank you for joining us anyway. So let's see. So here's a photo, kind of an aerial photo from the 1970s of the property. The physical address was 2285 North Econlockhatchee Trail in Union Park, like I said, on the east side of town. Some of the ads in the paper describe it as 6 miles from Colonial Plaza or 10 minutes from downtown. That's changed quite a bit over the years, obviously, from getting downtown out there. As we kind of stand now, you're about probably 12 miles driving, which can take various lengths of time depending on the time of day. But if you head east on Highway 50 or Colonial towards UCF or the Space Coast, and then turn left on North Econ, you cross the actual Econ River, which you can see in that photo there, and the stadium would have been on your right. So the actual kind of bridge and road there has changed multiple times over the years, so it's been like straightened out and moved a little bit here. So, but that is, roughly kind of what that land still looks like today. And then also you see on the right there was an an ad for events coming up or, potentially people looking to host events. So it had some kind of fast stats about the stadium itself. The building was 160 feet by 300 feet, and the floor, like the actual event floor, was 90 feet by 240 feet, which is pretty comparable to like a modern day arena facility. The seating capacity was between 7,000 and 9,000, depending on what the event was. And there were 28 acres of parking and exhibit space, so pretty significant there. You can see in the photo there's a lot of cars parked. TV lighting and sound systems, concessions, modern restroom facilities. So aside from what's actually in this ad, the building would be considered pretty utilitarian by today's standards, with bleacher seating and no air conditioning. So in an effort to cool the building, they would sometimes spray cold water on the roof a few hours before events, which was a minor improvement, but really was no match for the Florida summer. They did have heat in the building, but it was basically the same kind of heaters that you would use in an orange grove, so not necessarily the central heat that you would think about in a more modern facility today. So the building opened officially in November of 1967. November 8th was an open house that allowed for the first public look of the building. Members of the media and local dignitaries were invited to come check it out. They actually received an invitation by mail that was in the shape of a little cowboy hat, which I think is kind of cool. Mayor Carl Langford was there, as were hundreds of other folks. Over the next few days, the final preparations were made for the first 3 events, which would run on consecutive nights that began on Monday, November 13th. So the first ever event in the building was a professional wrestling card headlined by 2 major stars of the day, Johnny Valentine and Eddie Graham, whose name you will hear again later. The next night was the King of Jazz, Louis Armstrong, who would perform, and then, good, yeah, Louis Armstrong fan over here. Awesome. Me too. So the third of the 3 events was a popular country singer named Kitty Wells. And I think it's pretty fair to say that, yeah, there we go. I like it. Cool. So, I think there's a pretty eclectic lineup, you could say, of, people of pretty significant note. So it was cool that was kind of the first 3 shows. So I wanted to kind of dive into those first 3 and tell you why those were kind of significant for the history of the stadium. So professional wrestling has a pretty storied history here in Florida, and certainly contributed to the success of the stadium. Previously, the matches were hosted at the American Legion near Lake Ivanhoe and were promoted by a gentleman named Milo Steinborn. Wrestling as a business operated very differently than it does today, and this is before cable television and long before the internet made it possible to watch, pretty much anything at the click of a button. So today there are only a few major wrestling companies here in America, and when they come to town, it's basically like any other, rock show or circus or anything like that. So they come once or twice a year and people go, and that's kind of it. But back at this time, Florida ran as a territory where a group of wrestlers traveled kind of as a circuit, and many of the big cities in Florida would have shows every single week. And you would see this in other areas across the countries as well, who had their own stars and their own circuit of cities. But here in Florida, the official name of the company was Championship Wrestling from Florida, and their home base was in Tampa, but Orlando was a weekly town for them. So you see the kind of matches going on there in the stadium, which is a really cool shot. So kind of keep in mind that this is way before Orlando had any major professional sports teams. So there was no Magic, there was no Orlando City, there was no Pride, anything like that. So in the same way that people, have season tickets for the Magic or go to every Orlando City match or something like that, there were people who went to wrestling every single week. And because of that, the wrestlers really became kind of like hometown heroes before we had massively famous athletes or anything like that. And it's really, it may be kind of hard to understand nowadays with how much things have changed, but, wrestling was a really big part of the success of the stadium and also, just local culture in that way. So it was fitting that wrestling was the first event and would be pretty much a weekly thing for many years to come and would later become an even bigger part of the building story. Night 2, so that was a Monday, this is a Tuesday, was a world-renowned jazz musician known for his trumpet playing and singing. We could probably spend a lot more time on Louis Armstrong, but he's a significant figure in jazz music and just in American culture in general, I would say. Some of his more popular songs that you may know, What a Wonderful World, Hello Dolly, and probably the most famous recorded version of When the Saints Go Marching In, among many others. So yeah, good one, right? So Armstrong was born in 1901, and by the time of this concert in 1967, he'd been performing all over the world for nearly 50 years. He had played Orlando before, in fact. In 1952, he appeared at the South Street Casino, which was built by Dr. William Monroe Wells, one of the first black physicians in Orlando and the namesake of the Wells-built Museum of African American History and Culture. As this was the era of segregation, and that was very prevalent in the South, musicians who made stops at the South Street Casino were black performers who performed to black audiences. The venue was considered to be part of the Chitlin Circuit, which was a network of African American owned clubs that welcomed performers who may have not been welcomed with open arms at white-owned venues who hosted entertainment. So the South Street Casino and other clubs like it were real safe havens for both entertainers and patrons of the era. Armstrong would return in 1957 and performed at the Municipal Auditorium, which is now what we call the Bob Carr. So this time he performed for a mixed crowd, but unfortunately the seating inside the auditorium was segregated. And then in 1964, of course, the Civil Rights Act passed, and the Orlando Sports Stadium kind of became the first large-scale venue to open after this breakthrough. So as a result of that, the seating at the sports stadium was not segregated, was never designed to be segregated. So that meant that anyone who wanted to go see this concert or any of the other events could buy any available ticket and come, and I think that's a pretty notable thing kind of in the history of entertainment here in Orlando. So a really cool kind of part of our local history as well. And then finally, the third of the evening, or of the week there, was a performer named Kitty Wells. And hers is a name that you don't necessarily see as often today or hear about, but she's a really big deal and kind of a trailblazer in the history of country music. She has many accolades to her name. First solo woman to have a #1 record on the country charts, first woman to sell 1 million records in country music, and the first woman to headline a major country music tour. So quite a feat. There are many iconic women in country music, and if you go back to kind of some of the gold standards, like your Patsy Cline, Loretta Lynn, even Dolly Parton, Kitty Wells really predates all of those folks. She was born in 1919 and performed for over 60 years, first singing with her sisters on the radio in 1937 until her last performance in 2000, and she passed away in 2012. Her signature song was called It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels, and that was released in 1952. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but I recommend you check it out if not. The song is really interesting because it's essentially a response song to another song that was released earlier that year called The Wild Side of Life by a musician named Hank Thompson. And I won't read through all the lyrics, I'll spare you of that, but basically the original song, the sort of reference to Honky Tonk Angels, is about women who are hanging out in bars and stepping out on their men and basically, calling them not wife material. So Kitty's song kind of takes issue with that and, has a response to that in a very kind of interesting way, basically saying that if these women aren't good wives, maybe it's because their husbands aren't such great husbands and maybe have forgotten their end of the bargain. So, this is probably an early example, I guess, of standing up against the idea that the ones causing the problems in these relationships are women, or at least the relationships as depicted in country music songs, which all seems kind of tame today, but it's a pretty common theme, I guess, in music or country music today especially. But in 1952, this was enough to ruffle some folks' feathers, and Wells was not allowed to perform this song at the Grand Ole Opry, and the NBC radio refused to play it. So even with that, it became a huge hit and is really a classic of country music today. So, Wells was really able to put something out there that the country music establishment didn't really like, but the public did, and she had a really loyal fan base throughout her life after that. And many others, both men and women, have kind of taken the same path in country music and music in general. And when she came to the stadium in 1967, her persona wasn't quite so controversial anymore, but she was still a big draw on tour, and a lot of folks at the time and even now refer to her as the queen of country music. So I think she's a lot bigger deal than people really give her credit for, and I think it's pretty great that such a pioneer was part of the opening of the stadium. And after that first run of events, I think they were pretty much off to the races and stayed busy for a long time after that. So here you see some photos of Mr. Ashlock. So over there on the left is a photo of him with actor Ken Curtis, who played Festus on the television show Gunsmoke. He appeared at the stadium as part of the RCA Rodeo Championship in 1969. Celebrities would appear at these events to kind of drum up attention and attendance. And kind of the main reason why I wanted to include this is if you look behind them, so this was actually taken in Pete's office, so you can see there's some framed photos, and on the left side you see a picture of Pete with Louis Armstrong from that first week in 1967, and then on the other side there's a photo, it's like a group shot taken in the ring at the wrestling show with Pete and several folks, including Milo Steinborn, the promoter, as well as Eddie Graham and Johnny Valentine. And then the photo to the right there, the gentleman with Pete is a man named Robert Reiner, who was a big name and kind of pioneer of sports marketing and management. He worked in football, basketball, tennis. But it's a cool shot because you can see the wooden bleachers, and it kind of gives you an idea of what it was like to be in the stadium kind of in that era. And, Pete really was the face of the stadium. He got a lot of media coverage, and a lot of that sort of centered around him, and rightly so. But he was, really well known in the community. But I think the stadium was a real sort of team effort, and it really was a small business and kind of operated as such. So Barbara and Alan had shared with me the names of some of the folks throughout their sort of telling of this story who were really involved in kind of making everything go. And I'm sure there are many more, so I don't mean this to be a complete list, but I wanted to kind of name some of those people just so they get their sort of credit for contributing so much to the stadium. Jim Hayes was the general manager of the stadium. Priscilla Gray was the office manager. The Westerman family handled the concessions. Fred Conway headed up the cleaning efforts. Max Wyman was the director of the Boys Club and would bring the club to do parking as kind of like a fundraiser. And then a couple of folks named Anna and Sarge would help with setups and setting the chairs and all that kind of thing. So I want to talk about a couple of the specific types of events that were hosted there. The big ones, I guess, is the rodeo was really, the catalyst for the stadium to begin with, and was a featured part of the stadium's programming for many years. And the first one that ever took place was in January of 1968. Over the years, the stadium would host, rodeos for the Rodeo Cowboy Association and the Association of Florida Rodeos. It was a great venue for this type of event. There was plenty of room for the animals, and there were stables kind of on the property to help house that. I want to point out kind of on the far end there, you see Roy Rogers and Dale Evans from 1971. This is an ad from 1971. And Roy Rogers was an actor and musician known as the Singing Cowboy, and at one point was one of the most famous people in America. Dale Evans was also a singer and a film star, and they got married in 1947. The two starred together in The Roy Rogers Show and did the show's theme song, which if you don't know the show, you probably still know the song. It's called Happy Trails. Anybody know that one? Yeah. So happy trails to you until we meet again. In the country western world, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans are again like real icons, so it was a big feather in the cap to have them there. And you'll also note the first day of that event was Thursday, November 25th, which was also Thanksgiving, so they enjoyed their Thanksgiving dinner with the Ashlock family that year, as their house was right across from the stadium. So pretty cool there. Boxing had a long history at the stadium as well. Pete Ashlock wanted to do not only professional fights, but also have a place to develop fighters. So there was a gym on site with a ring and everything so the fighters could train right there. Events were held twice a month, and while they weren't necessarily profitable, Ashlock didn't really seem to care. And I'm going back and citing this Sports Illustrated article again. Says, the other night he took in $5,126 on a boxing card. His expenses were $7,000. Don't matter, says Ashlock. I just bought a $1,900 ticket and I had a good time. And in the post-midnight shadows of the barn-like stadium, he explains, when you're trying to sell the public something you like, you're at their mercy. If we'd had more people tonight, I'd have lost less, and if we'd had less people, I'd have lost more. But boxing is an individual thing, and I like that. And if I keep 2 or 3 kids off the street or out of jail, it's worth it to me. So despite some financial struggles promoting local fights, there were some notable names that would come to fight right here in Orlando, including George Foreman, who is one of the most famous boxers of all time. Foreman won a gold medal in boxing in 1968 at the Olympics. In 1969, he was just beginning his professional career and came to Orlando to have an exhibition fight against a man named Cleveland Williams, the Big Cat. He's pictured here with Mike Quarry, who was a light heavyweight star who appeared on many cards at the stadium over the years as well. And not to take away from George's amazing boxing career, but if you aren't super familiar with him from the sport, Foreman is also known for his immensely popular Foreman grill, which came out in 1994 and was pretty much omnipresent in kitchens all over the place. I think the full name was George Foreman's Lean, Mean, Fat Reducing Grilling Machine. So there's still quite a few of those out there. But again, also pretty notable boxer. So less than 4 years later, in 1973, Foreman would win the World Heavyweight Championship, defeating Joe Frazier. And he would eventually lose the title to Muhammad Ali and Zaire in the famed Rumble in the Jungle fight. And that fight also has some significance for the stadium, even though it took place quite far from here. The fight was so anticipated that people all over the world clamored to see it as it happened. So it was shown at many closed-circuit locations, which is something that the sports stadium hosted. And what is a closed-circuit location for those of you who are unaware of that. So before boxing fights and other special events could be viewed on demand or streaming online, there was a service on your television called pay-per-view, which still exists in some form but not quite as prevalent as it used to be. And it would basically be you paid a healthy fee and your cable system would descramble a channel so you could watch the event as it happened. But before cable television kind of became the norm, people would actually obtain the rights to play these fights at venues, so like a theater, an arena, or something like that. And hundreds, if not thousands, of people would come in person. They would actually have to go to the site rather than watch it at home, and they would pay their admission fee. And it would become kind of an event in itself because you're around a lot of other people, and they would do concessions and that kind of thing. So Ashlock was a promoter for that fight here locally and also in many other locations across the country. So kind of a neat tie-in there. But in talking about Muhammad Ali, who is somebody who really transcends boxing, he is known as the greatest for a reason and probably one of the most important athletes that ever lived. And he also participated in an exhibition fight in April of 1975 here in Orlando at the sports stadium. So if you're a really astute boxing historian, you'll note that Muhammad Ali was actually the world champion at the time of this exhibition fight in April of 1975. So even though the title wouldn't be on the line, I think it's pretty significant to have a reigning heavyweight champion of the world in your building. He did a total of 6 rounds, 3 rounds with Rodney Bobick and 3 rounds with Levi Forte, who were both part of his camp. And they weren't competitive fights, but any chance to see Ali was a pretty big deal. And it was staged as a fundraiser for the Orlando School of Black Performing Arts. So a really kind of cool distinction to have those two in the building as well. One thing that doesn't get talked about as much with the sports stadium is its history with basketball. Ashlock had some dealings with the Miami Floridians, who were a franchise of the American Basketball Association, or the ABA. The ABA would last only 9 years, from 1967 to 1976, but was really influential in basketball history. Four teams from the ABA would eventually be absorbed by the NBA when the two organizations merged. The Indiana Pacers, Denver Nuggets, San Antonio Spurs, and the New York Nets, who became the New Jersey Nets and now the Brooklyn Nets. In 1968, while the ABA was still kind of growing, they hosted two exhibition games here in Orlando on October 13th against the New England Buccaneers and October 20th against the Dallas Capitals, who would eventually become the San Antonio Spurs. And there was a thought that the Floridians would play a regular season game in November here, but that never came to fruition. So for the exhibition games, about 2,000 people came, and while that certainly wasn't an embarrassing number, it wasn't really setting the world on fire either. And the ABA wasn't necessarily doing great business in its early years and didn't have a lot of stars of major note yet. But a couple of years later, the Floridians got new ownership and would drop the Miami from their name, and meaning that it basically was not going to be associated with any specific city, and instead they would play their games in various parts of Florida. So the thought was that Orlando could get up to 7 of those games, but that also didn't come to be, and the team split its time between Miami, West Palm Beach, Jacksonville, Tampa, and St. Petersburg. So when the idea existed that they would kind of call Orlando home, Ashlock purchased the basketball floor. He ended up having to sell it at quite a loss. And had things gone differently, one of the reasons I really wanted to note this is because had things gone differently, we potentially would have had a professional basketball team almost 20 years before the Orlando Magic. And while the franchise may or may not have been successful enough to be part of that NBA merger, there certainly would have been some notable names coming to town, quite a few many years before the Magic. So I find that kind of fascinating. And then another very memorable part of the stadium complex was the motocross track, which began in 1971, and it was the races were staged by a promoter named Russ Coe. And for a time, the track was on the American Motorcyclist Association circuit, which is a pretty big distinction. Coe convinced Ashlock to build this track, and it was located at the edge of the property, right next to the Econ River. They hosted events monthly and had both, people from all over Florida and Georgia competing, but also nationally because, of course, Florida had ideal weather in the winter months. And it wasn't just the people participating that came to these, it was a big spectator thing as well. An article from 1972 mentions that it was $3 to view the motocross, but children under 12 were admitted free when they were accompanied by a responsible adult. I don't really know what constitutes responsible, but it seems like everybody had a good time. And many people remember the motocross competitions more than anything else that happened at the stadium, and it's a big part of the history. And, so many events happened there just to, anybody who was of age at that time or was interested in going and doing things in town, there was probably something that piqued your interest. There were horse shows and roller derby and political rallies and ice shows and religious gatherings. The Harlem Globetrotters were there, the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey were there, and there were concerts, of course, which is a huge part of the history. But because of all that activity going on, it's not without issues, and I think there were some problems that happened that didn't necessarily get favorable coverage in the news. For all the cool events they put on, there were definitely some problems here and there. And I think a lot of that stemmed from the fact that rock and roll shows were kind of a new thing. So I think there was sort of a culture clash in a lot of ways with, some people kind of fearing their kids being corrupted by going to these shows and, the sort of long hair culture. And in a lot of ways, I think concerts were really growing in that manner too, where, of course, concerts existed for a long time before this, but these big shows where we're kind of learning how to handle this, like, the security and the parking and everything that kind of goes into putting on a massive show like that. If people come to shows and they fight or they drink or they're doing other illicit activity, how do we handle that kind of thing? So it wasn't just a problem at the sports stadium. I think many venues had these challenges, but in the early years, law enforcement would clash with attendees, and while I wasn't there, so I can't get too deep into the psychology of that, I think it's safe to say there were definitely some issues from time to time. And probably the biggest thing that ever happened there on that front was a concert by a musician named John Sebastian, which was on September 10th, 1971. He was a popular musician who was known as a member of the band The Lovin' Spoonful, but he went solo in 1968. He's very popular, but wouldn't necessarily be considered, extreme rock music or anything like that. So his songs were pretty mellow. In fact, one of his best-known songs would come out a few years after that, was called Welcome Back, the theme song to Welcome Back, Kotter, the popular television show with John Travolta as a young man. So this wasn't really the type of concert that you would expect any kind of issue at. And there's a lot of information about this, and as I mentioned, I wasn't there, but there were some gate crashers who tried to enter the show without a ticket, and understandably this caught the attention of some on-duty officers. There were rocks and bottles being thrown, and again, certainly a cause for concern as far as security goes. And while all this is happening outside, the people who were inside who had paid and were enjoying the show really had no idea what was happening. At some point, tear gas was used inside by the riot police, which some people felt was a bit of an overreaction. And again, the people inside weren't really even aware of what was going on here. And it was reported at the end of that there were 80 officers on the scene and a total of 28 people were arrested. 10 deputies and an undetermined number of youths, as it says, were taken to the hospital that night. So needless to say, it was not a good situation at all. But I think the most tragic part of this was a car accident that would kind of come to be associated with this concert. As law enforcement was being called in, an unmarked sheriff's car was rushing to the scene and collided with another vehicle at the intersection of Cimarron and East Colonial Drive. And in this accident, a 16-year-old named Diane Calvert was injured, and an 18-year-old named Janet McFerrin was killed. So this is obviously an extremely sad and unfortunate situation, and it received a lot of news coverage at the time. There were a lot of headlines that kind of implied that this was probably more of a direct result of the stadium than maybe was fair, and kind of made it sound like it happened there, which, was kind of upsetting to a lot of the folks who were involved in the stadium itself. So ultimately, the most serious incident associated with the sports stadium didn't even really happen there, and luckily nothing of this magnitude would ever happen again. And again, it's a really unfortunate thing to discuss, but I wanted to make sure, it's something that does come up a lot with this, and it is part of the stadium's history, so definitely not a bright point, but something of note. But fortunately, the majority of the concerts were, very peaceful affairs, and a really unbelievable list of musicians performed there over the years. And this is just like a small smattering, but just to kind of read out a few of the I would think most people recognize at least some of these names. Santana, Sonny and Cher, The Who, James Brown, Kiss, Isaac Hayes, Jethro Tull, Johnny Cash, The Supremes, Grand Funk Railroad, Black Sabbath, Bob Dylan, Blue Oyster Cult, Foghat, Peter Frampton, The Beach Boys, Leonard Skinner, the Allman Brothers, Wilson Pickett, Glenn Campbell, Willie Nelson. So something for everybody there. So I think it's pretty cool that so many notable people performed there. And I want to highlight just two quickly that are probably the most talked about in the history of the stadium. So Led Zeppelin is obviously one of the biggest rock and roll bands that ever existed. Formed in 1968, I think along with the Beatles and Rolling Stones are probably about as iconic as it gets. And, I think the word rock star is probably overused quite a bit, but they were real, genuine, bona fide rock stars. And this was on August 31st, 1971, which was a really vital time both for the band and for our local area. So you think of August 31st being the last day of August, then you have September, and then on October 1st, 1971 was the opening of Walt Disney World. So this was, exactly 1 month after the show, and would really kind of change the trajectory of the area quite a bit. I don't think Orlando always gets the credit for being a growing town before Disney, but it's certainly a flashpoint in our history and really sparked a change that would make Orlando one of the major cities in the state, and thus being able to get world-class entertainers. So today it wouldn't necessarily be a surprise for a band like a Led Zeppelin, of this era to kind of come and play Orlando. We have a lot of venues, from clubs and theaters, arenas, and even a stadium that has hosted, the biggest of the big acts. But 50 years ago, this wasn't really the case, and there were a lot of venues that would have had to, there weren't a lot of venues that would have made sense for a band like Led Zeppelin to perform in. And I think that's what makes the sports stadium really special in a lot of ways, is that it provided a space for all these things to happen in an era that, otherwise probably wouldn't have. So as far as Led Zeppelin is concerned, this is 2 months before they released their fourth album. In November of 1971, they released what is a technically untitled album, but known as Led Zeppelin 4. And these songs really have what a lot of people associate with them, to this day, including probably one of the most notable rock and roll songs of all time, Stairway to Heaven. They'd been playing some of these tracks over the summer, but in theory, unless you were like a real diehard fan, you go to the show, you've never heard the songs off this album, so you're hearing them for the first time. And I think that it's not only cool to have a historically significant band play your venue, but also at a time that's so important to their history as well, and really kind of at their apex in a lot of ways. So because Led Zeppelin is so notable, there are kind of recordings to this day floating around of the stadium, or the show at the stadium. There are audio recordings. And it's cool because you kind of get a feel for really being there. And, Robert Plant comes out and basically introduces this song as like just the new song off the album, and nobody really reacts. So it's kind of cool to hear that, funny in that way. And then the other concert that I really want to focus on was Elvis Presley, which I think, is certainly an icon around the world, and most people are familiar with him. But he's originally from Mississippi and famously made his home in Memphis, Tennessee. But not everyone, I think, realizes how vital Florida was in the development of his career. In 1955 and 1956, during his pretty unprecedented rise to fame, he toured Florida 4 times. This is chronicled in depth, I just want to note real quick here, in a really fantastic book called Elvis Ignited, The Rise of an Icon in Florida by Bob Keeling. Bob is a real history authority here in Central Florida, has a lot of really great books, but if you're from this area and you're at all interested in Elvis, I would highly recommend you checking this one out. So specifically in Central Florida in those years, he played in Daytona Beach and Lakeland, but he did 5 shows here in Orlando, all of which were at the Municipal Auditorium. The first was on May 11th, 1955, and was part of a show with Hank Snow. Then he did 2 dates with a comedian who would attain later fame, Andy Griffith. And then in 1956, he did 2 shows at the Municipal Auditorium, and he was the headliner that you kind of think of today. So things would change for Elvis in the following years. In 1958, he was drafted in the Army, and when his service was over, he would turn his focus to appearing in movies. So he would only come back to Orlando to play one more time, and that was on February 15th, 1977. His famous private airplane, the Lisa Marie, named for his daughter, would fly in and out of the executive airport, so that's the plane pictured there. And he would stay at the Hilton Inn West on West Colonial Drive. So there's a photo of Elvis on that day, so pretty cool. The show was sold out. It was delayed 20 minutes in hopes of getting everyone in who was stuck in the traffic jam. I also want to note that this is on February 15th, which would be the day after Valentine's Day, so I'm sure there were people who got tickets to the show for that, so that's pretty cool. I think people really have in their head a sort of version of Elvis in his later years, and a lot of the sort of coverage of him at the time was probably a little mean-spirited, but he could still put on a show, and like I said, it was sold out, and I think that he really had that charisma that people, kind of latched to if they were fans of him, they were fans, throughout their life. And I think people really stuck with him, and he was still playing to huge crowds despite, any kind of negative press or anything like that. So that's him that night. He played quite a few of the songs that he's kind of best known for, including It's Now or Never, All Shook Up, Don't Be Cruel, Hound Dog, and his last song was Can't Help Falling in Love. By all descriptions, it was a pretty amazing night, and unfortunately this would be the last time he would play in Orlando, as 6 months later he would pass away at only the age of 42. So very popular amongst people of all ages to this day, and kind of interesting that he played here right at the end of his life. So everything I've talked about today is really about the kind of original incarnation of the sports stadium, owned by Pete Ashlock. the building would have a couple of lives after that. So even though I would consider these kind of completely separate operations, I just wanted to kind of touch on what happened to the property and why it eventually ended up gone. By the end of the 1970s, the stadium wasn't really as viable as it had been in early years, and Pete Ashlock made the decision to get out of that business. So in January 1980, he deeded the property to the Southeast National Bank of Orlando, who made it clear that they were not going to run the business. So if the building closed, the group that would be most affected by this at this point would be Championship Wrestling from Florida, who had held shows there almost every week for the past 12 years. So in 1980, an agreement was reached to sell the building to two business partners from Tampa, Tom Smith, who was a partner in the Brewmaster Steakhouse, who were popular in Tampa for a while, and Eddie Graham, the wrestler who had headlined the very first show at the building and by this time had taken over as the promoter and the head of Championship Wrestling from Florida. So you see Eddie is up there on the left kind of in action. They took over the building and began doing their weekly shows there again. During the 70s, the events were typically held on Monday nights, but by the time they changed ownerships, they were doing shows on Sunday evenings, and the building was renamed to the Eddie Graham Sports Complex. So, and just to kind of briefly explain who Eddie Graham was, for those of you who may not know, he was a really monumental figure in wrestling. He became a big star in the 50s nationally, but in the 60s, he made Florida his home and really became a staple here and would eventually take over the office. He was considered a real innovator and was really respected in terms of his creativity, because you have to keep in mind that, these people were coming out to the shows every single week, buying their ticket and coming. So the sort of creativity involved in people, keeping people interested in spending money every single week, you definitely have to have a mind for that, and he certainly did. And even outside of wrestling, he was a really well-known personality throughout the state. He supported a lot of charitable efforts and was instrumental in founding the Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch, now the Florida Sheriff's Youth Ranch. He passed away in 1985, and his son Mike Gossett, known professionally as Mike Graham, took over the stadium and the wrestling operation. But by 1987, things had changed so much in the wrestling world that the sort of Florida territory wasn't quite as viable, and the company merged with a nationally known company before just shutting down kind of altogether in November of 1987. So there would be a few attempts to bring sort of localized wrestling back, but none really stuck. And there were a lot of very notable names. I'm sure most of the the wrestlers that you could think of from that era had performed there at various points. But the one that I really want to highlight, in addition to the Grahams, would be Dusty Rhodes, who I think reached almost like folk hero type status here in Central Florida during the 70s and 80s. He left here as a full-time performer in 1984, but he was really the face of that company, and I think fans and non-fans to this day really remember him here in this area. And during this time, the stadium, while wrestling was going on, they would host some other events, but by 1983, the Orange County Convention Center had opened, so there was competition in terms of an indoor arena type thing. So today, a lot of people use the Eddie Graham Sports Complex and the sports stadium kind of interchangeably, but they were kind of two separate businesses. And I think that the Eddie Graham and sort of his involvement in wrestling and the community here, and of course the stadium, probably warrants a completely separate conversation. So I'm gonna move on from that. But in 1990, Mike Graham sold the stadium, and it was renamed the Orlando Sports Club, and it was used to host indoor soccer competitions, and also had some concerts of the era. But by then, again, another competitor was here, and in 1989, the Orlando Arena opened. So again, not as many shows as it had once had, but some notable acts. Two Live Crew, who was a hip-hop group, very controversial, from Miami, and then a lot of notable rock bands, Jane's Addiction, Pantera, Skid Row, Living Colour, and Slayer. At this time, there were neighborhoods being built around the stadium. There was an apartment complex directly across the street, so definitely weren't making any friends by having these hard rock shows at the time. There were traffic problems, and it just kind of became not a viable situation anymore. So by 1993, any use of the stadium had pretty much come to an end, and Orange County had closed the facility due to code violations. Real estate company took over and wanted to potentially repurpose it as an event space, but it wasn't to be. Sat idle for a few years until it was eventually demolished in the fall of 1995. Fortunately, there was no pomp and circumstance involved in that, and it was kind of just taken down over the course of a couple of weeks. So if you were to visit the spot today, there's really nothing there to indicate that it had ever been there. This is a shot of the neighborhood that kind of sits right where it was. It's called the Econ River Estate. So again, if you go down 50, just past the big Greenway Ford dealership and turn left at Econ, it's basically at the intersection of Marathon and Econ there. So it's not super hard to find, but there's nothing really there of much interest if you're looking for signs of the stadium. And I always kind of wondered if the folks who live there are kind of aware of this history. Maybe, maybe not, and hopefully, by doing more things like this, people will be more aware. So as we kind of conclude here, I just want to say that, at the History Center, we talk a lot about people who have contributed to the landscape of Central Florida. And when you talk about a lot of the movers and shakers of that era, I think that Pete Ashlock probably doesn't get his due in a lot of ways for creating this environment and playing host to some of the major names in entertainment who otherwise probably wouldn't have ever come to town. He passed away in 1988, but I think he probably squeezed as much life out of his years as anyone had. So for folks who remember going to the concerts or wrestling or the rodeo or anything like that, I think that the sports stadium holds a special lore. And I think places like arenas are kind of a big deal in a lot of ways just because of all the great memories that people are able to make there. And I think it's an important part of, kind of living your life is going to these really cool things that are important to you. And then for those who never got to see it or who may have not known that it existed, I think it's really fascinating to know that so much had happened there. And these are stories that we kind of hope to share with you because I think it's a really important part of our local history that's worth remembering. So with that, I want to thank you for coming, and it's been fun. So I wanted to open up our questions. I don't know if anybody has submitted any questions. I know we're kind of running short on time here. Any online questions?
So, someone online said, if we have any cool photographs or mementos from having visited the stadium or events, how do we donate those?
Oh, that's great. We would love to have them. So if you visit thehistorycenter.org, you can find contact information and you can reach out, and we would be happy to talk to you about that. And again, that is something that we're definitely pursuing for our collection. As I mentioned, we do have some things from the Ashlock family. We're hoping to obtain some more, but if anybody has anything out there, we're definitely interested because it's not something that's well represented in our collection at this point. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that you were in contact with the Ashlock family. Have you reached out to anyone left living of the Grahams?
Actually, it's funny you mention that, yes. So Eddie Graham's granddaughter, Nicole, we've done an oral history with her as well. So as I said, I think that this is a little bit of a separate discussion maybe, just because I wouldn't want to try to cram all that in, in this particular conversation. But I think that there's definitely some material that we're hoping to do maybe in the future that focuses a little more on that end as well. So I want to give kind of both sides of it their due just because so much happened in both of the eras. So, but yeah, that's great. Cool. All right. If that's it, I just want to thank you for being here today. Hope you enjoyed the program.